Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along. For those of you that might not know me, my name's Robert Lawson from the School of English, and today I'm going to be talking about comedy and the reinvention of the city. Now, just to give you a quick background to my research and where I'm coming from, I'm a sociolinguist. I'm interested in the intersection of language and society. Sort of, that's a really broad definition, but at the moment it'll serve our purposes. More particularly, my research in recent years has focused on the role of the media in understanding processes of language variation and change. So at the moment I have an ongoing research project with my colleague Dr. Ursula Lutsky, looking at patterns of gender and interruption in the TV show Mock the Week, looking particularly at the communicative practices of the female panellists. I'm currently expanding that programme of research to think about what impact particular sociolinguistic performances might have on broader social structures and in particular perceptions of cities and countries. So this current paper that I'm presenting looks at how comedy performances of this idea of the hard man masculinity in the public eye might be part of how an industrial heartland kind of reinvents itself. So this talk really examines the extent to which comedy shows in Glasgow in Scotland. I'm sure everyone will hopefully know where Glasgow is. Maybe, I don't know. Creates a space in which tough masculinity is parodied, caricatured and reshaped, and how comedy programmes really function as arenas of competing performatives of masculinities. But more than that, what I also want to look at is how we can focus on these kinds of texts in a way that allows us to ask what impact the broadcast media have on evaluative and ideological worlds in which language variation in late modernity, and that's some work by Nicholas Coupland. So to that end, I also consider how this reshaping and reframing of tough masculinity might be considered in light of the reinvention of Glasgow as a city of leisure and tourism as opposed to a city of crime and violence. And this is building on some work by Carvalho 2013, who argues that the media play a really important role in constructing a particular image of a city or a location and how this particular image can be viewed by a variety of publics. And in particular, this idea is focused on, again by Nick Coupland, who makes the point that the media can undermine community and break established patterns of association and value, and it can also enable marginal agencies to surface, potentially altering hierarchical relationships. So later on in my talk, I'll focus more on how this role of the media is actually a really integral part of allowing marginal agencies to surface. Now, before I go on to actually look at some data, I think it's worthwhile just looking at the history of Glasgow. And I think it's fair to say that the history of Glasgow is a storied one, particularly focused round about images of crime and violence that start to emerge round about the 1920s and 1930s. And probably the first media treatment of this kind is MacArthur and Kingsley Long's 1935 novel, No Mean City, that charts the rise and fall of Johnny Stark, this infamous razor king of the Gorbals, who's a really prototypical example of this Glasgow hard man, someone whose social practices demonstrate engagement with a culture of excessive aggression and violence. Are people familiar with this novel at all? Excellent. That's always really useful to hear. It's a really good book. It's, as I say, it's old, but it's really one of these first ones where we have the kind of commodification and commercialisation of Glasgow as a violent city. Now, this particular stereotype of Glasgow, in particular the idea of the hard man, is visible across a range of contemporary and historical texts, including movies, novels, non-fiction literature, documentaries, crime movies, and particularly for the purposes of this talk, comedy shows like Burniston, Rab C. Nisbet and Chewing the Fat. Most of you, I would hope, will be familiar with the Rab C. Nisbet at least. And these kind of emerge as a kind of response, I suppose, as Glasgow starts to reinvent itself in the 1980s, particularly as outside investments starting to wane. Glasgow really embarked on a radical mission to bring people back to the city. And it begins with the really famous Glasgow's Miles Better campaign in 1983. This eventually culminated in the city being awarded European City of Culture in 1990. So in light of this kind of reinvention story, it's really no surprise that we start to see a different treatment of Glasgow emerge in the media, and particularly this image of the hard man. And I believe that not only do these kinds of media treatments show that the hard man's a viable object of satire, of parody, of caricature, it also contests these kind of dominant ideologies of what it is to be a man in Glasgow, but alongside that shows us how these media texts are part of a sort of more distributed system of how Glasgow reinvents itself, and particularly has reinvented itself over the last 20 years. Now I just want to show you a quick clip of some data that forms the basis of the argument that I'm making here, which is from the TV show Chewing the Fat. I'm going to guess if that very few of you will be familiar with this particular segment called The Big Man, and he's this prototypical hard man who embodies tough masculinity. For those of you that are not familiar with Scottish Standard English or Scots or Glaswegian vernacular, I've subtitled it for you, so we shouldn't be losing you too much.
See if you've got a problem. You don't want a wee man to come and help you. You want a big man in your corner. Oh you, funny boys. You touch him again, I'll slap you that hand, your freckles will hit a tarmac. You're out for a night in the town. You don't want to be seen with a pub with wee toy school tits like these. No, you want to be seen with a pub with big enormous tits like these. The type that take 2 ounces to squeeze and a dice to suck. No funny dogs, like a bar soda or a pint of mince. See me you give a young guy a makeover for tipping a big man's daughter on a big man's couch using a Johnny bag stolen for the big man's Jake. You don't want a wee damn freezer like this. You want a big shiny samurai sword like this. What's that, son? A short back side? No, the big man wants to eat you 6 inches off the top. Big.
Okay, so I suppose the first thing to say about this is that media performances are multimodal. And indeed, there's a number of things going on here that are not linguistic. So the first is how quick the main character is to use violence to solve problems, from threatening his boyfriend's, his daughter's boyfriend, to stopping a mugging in the street. His overall demeanour and characterisation draws on a stereotypical idea of the Glasgow gangster, represented by the smart suit, the slick-backed hair, but also calling in some ideas referencing the Glasgow razor gangs as well, with the open blade razor in the first scene. But the social construction of his hardman identity isn't just built round about his semiotic resources. There's also a number of linguistic resources that he uses. So particular semantic fields, so violence will slap you that hard your freckles will hit the tarmac. He references sex, insults, individuality, all of these kinds of things drawn together to index this idea of the hard man. In terms of his voice quality, he's really low pitched. He has a particular pitch variance, increased volume, and so on, that are typically indexed as angry, aggressive, physically dominant. And it's this stereotypical Glasgow voice which contains slack articulation, jaw protrusion, and harsh phonation. That's not particularly interesting. Other things, he uses Glaswegian phonology throughout, so things like L vocalisation for baws instead of balls, or testicles, and a number of other features. And lastly, he uses this idea of the Glasgow patter, so freckles will hit the tarmac. So this verbal street smarts to show that not only can't he be bested physically, but he also can't be bested psychologically or through his humour. He's very quick-witted. Now, just to quickly finish up, to kind of go back to what I started this talk with, the text invites heightened levels of metalinguistic and metapragmatic processing, because audiences and perhaps performers themselves have to invoke their prior knowledge of sociolinguistic repertoires and ideologies in order to make sense of what is happening here. And as Hank 1998 highlights, it's the exploitation and subversion of these viewers' sociolinguistic knowledge and familiarity with these codes that these clips are supposed to be humorous. But moving beyond the analysis of his language, we can see that although this kind of stylised performances are supposed to be fun, it's often the mode in which serious historical tensions resurface for fresh application or reassessment. And I argue that seeing these particular kinds of texts as part of a broader move to reinvent certain aspects of Glasgow, particularly through the proxy of the hard man, is a particularly productive way of tackling these texts, and particularly looking at comedy as part of social change, which the current project stand.planet.com looks at, I think is a really interesting way of trying to tackle some of the issues that these comedy shows represent. Thank you very much.